The alarm didn't come with sirens, it came with a blink, on a weather satellite no longer used for weather. Above the upper exosphere, a gravitic pressure ripple passed through one of the old mining signal repeaters. It didn't ping the public networks. It fed directly into Relay Node 4, a dormant unit in the Weddell Sea. 3 hours before any government was aware of it, Earth had already confirmed the approach. Cold burn signatures, no thermal bloom, vector formation spanning 80 kilometers, silent, intentional, Kithari ascendancy, arriving not to threaten, but to execute. Above ground, the Security Council scrambled to verify what they barely understood. Spokespeople exchanged thin-lipped denials, scrambling through military backchannels, unaware that most of those channels had already been severed. National leaders blinked into confusion, their encrypted lines intercepted not by the enemy, but by Earth's own dead-hand contingency. Surface authorities were not meant to respond. Not to this. Instead, buried 5 kilometers beneath Greenland's ice cap, Aegir Command lit up like a heartbeat. Sealed in a zero-signal chamber, it had waited for this moment for 76 years. Deep code logic initiated the Tier 0 contact doctrine, an override designed to bypass all sovereign chains of command. No flags, no authorization, just execution. Commander Ryvan Hall didn't remember the chime that woke him, just the chill of concrete against his shoulder and the bitter sting of cold light across his eyes. He'd been asleep in the supply corridor of a derelict lighthouse, surrounded by the quiet thrum of tides and silence that had, until this morning, meant freedom. A decade prior, he'd vanished from command rotation after an untraceable fracture with Joint Systems Intelligence, officially retired, unofficially deleted. When the encrypted drone landed in the bay beneath his outpost, tipped. No noise, no lights, just presence. He didn't ask who sent it. He only asked how far underground they wanted him to go. The drone's cargo module opened without instruction. Inside, a breath-sealed data pack and an injection kit. Biometric unlocks pulsed beneath the gel casing. The data pack held 2 words. Delphi, active. He didn't say goodbye to the coastline. There was nothing sentimental about it. The past decade had been a holding pattern, a place to wait where no one would think to look. As he strapped into the drone's retrieval harness, Hal felt his heart settle. Not race. Like a man hearing the last note of a long-held song and knowing it had never stopped playing, only gone subterranean. The descent into Aegir wasn't a ride. It was an erasure. The ice elevator dropped beneath old glacial plates, through crust seams, into the forgotten bones of Earth's quiet war machine. No one spoke to him during intake. They didn't need to. Every corridor lit with the precise glow of recognition. Not ceremony, not respect, execution. The facility hadn't aged, because it had never lived. Aegir didn't exist in any map, military or otherwise. It wasn't buried, it was folded out of perception. By the time Hal reached the primary command ring, the Kithari Armada had already moved within Neptune's orbital perimeter. They hadn't hidden themselves, they hadn't needed to. In their doctrine, surprise wasn't achieved through stealth, it was achieved through assumption. They expected Earth to be loud, confused, delayed. They expected committees, sanctions, scattered radio calls, and counterpunches too late to matter. They didn't expect what Hal saw on the central tactical column. Civilian-grade satellites, weather sensors, traffic flow monitors, even low-budget telescope arrays had gone dark in precise arcs, but not from disruption. They had turned themselves off. Every node that once belonged to agriculture and logistics now shunted power to auxiliary computation nets. Cargo routes had shifted 6 hours ago. Autonomous mining ships had altered their drilling trajectories mid-operation to position above high-velocity ejection vectors. The world hadn't scrambled, it had repositioned, quietly, perfectly. Hal approached the Delphi Matrix terminal. It looked like a maintenance well, grated, featureless, stained with decades of geothermal residue. A simple palm scanner jutted from a recessed port, no different than the ones used in old border control gates. He placed his hand, a soft click, then pressure. The system drew blood, analyzed protein markers, and pulsed a neural handshake into his wrist. He didn't flinch. A man doesn't flinch from his own shadow. The floor beneath him shuddered, not from force, but from release. The terminal split along hidden seams, revealing a single descending interface, pale chrome, dustless. Delphi Phase 1 initialized. The first interface screen displayed a single line of code, looping in muted sequence. No greeting, no AI face, just clarity. Ascendancy confirmed, protocols verified, proceed to Strat Layer 1. He didn't pause to absorb it, because he already knew. This was never about escalation, it was about rehearsal. Everything on Earth, the cities, the trade networks, even the power grids, had been grown like scaffolding over a bone-deep lattice of response no one had needed to know. That was the design. The surface danced in diplomacy while the bones prepared for blood. The room dimmed, not as theater, as calibration. Tactical maps began shifting in real time, drawing gravity flow, vector deceleration patterns, Kithari positioning markers, and probable invasion descent corridors. A transparent ring of data expanded outward in layered arcs, reaching past Mars, past the asteroid belt, projecting into uninhabited orbit fields where Earth's real defenses had waited in plain sight for decades, disguised as mining shafts, deep storage platforms, and interplanetary debris. Nothing weaponized, just ready. Commander Hall stared at the predicted contact points. The Kithari wouldn't open with diplomacy. They didn't believe in it. To them, clarity came from action. So would Earth's reply, but not in kind. Earth's reply wouldn't shout, it wouldn't even signal. It would whisper, through movement, through misdirection, through systems too old and too passive-looking to be feared. And when the enemy fired first, Earth's silence would answer. Not with permission, with preparation. The Kithari didn't arrive in formation. They fractured their fleet into wide-arcing scout wings, each programmed with overlapping redundancies to avoid centralized exposure. It was smart, surgical even. One squadron traced the far edge of lunar orbit, another drifted past the asteroid belt using dead velocity maneuvers, and a third skimmed near Mars's magnetic tail, silent as a shadow. They weren't looking for resistance. They were looking for structure, signatures of fleet movement, planetary defense coordination, transmissions that screamed coherence. They found none. What little activity they intercepted reeked of desperation. Civilian satellites bled out static as power grids collapsed without pattern. Comms blinked irregularly, as if overwhelmed by crosstalk. Drone traffic rerouted across Earth's stratosphere, random and jittery. What the Kithari saw was a species mid-collapse. What they didn't see was Protocol Cinder, already pulsing beneath that chaos, weaving it. Across 6 continents, Earth's dormant drone reserves lit up in silent sync. Cinder's command logic didn't simulate defense, it simulated failure, strategic, messy, and almost believable. Outdated transport craft sputtered false engine surges in low orbit. Industrial towers broadcast mismatched emergency codes in a dozen languages. Scrambler balloons launched from storm shelters, releasing bursts of conflicting EM scatter designed to mimic cities with fractured infrastructure. The Kithari watched from their bridge clusters and saw panic. No rhythm, no standardization, no planetary doctrine. It was a performance, and they bought tickets. Commander Hall stood beneath Aegir's geospatial dome, watching Kithari scout vectors stretch toward what they believed were openings. He didn't speak. Behind him, a quiet swarm of operators worked the tactical shell, feeding motion drift data into a distributed system that cross-analyzed every enemy reaction against decades of war doctrine. Not human war, Kithari war. Argus Seed had been sifting it for years, an entangled net of deep space receivers hidden in the Oort cloud and Saturn's Lagrange points, digesting signal fragments, algorithmic radio bursts, and fleet acceleration curves. What it produced wasn't prediction, it was preemption. Hall moved his hand across the interface. The data realigned. The scouts were narrowing focus on the African Union's supposed defense corridor, an intentional dead zone flooded with staged civilian chatter and synthetic heat patterns. It was working. The Kithari interpreted it as a weak flank and rerouted a segment of their supply fleet behind the front line, positioning it for orbital relay establishment they were preparing to occupy. That was when Hull greenlit Phase 2. In a belt of forgotten mining platforms drifting between Earth and Mars, 3 automated shafts rotated toward pre-calculated vectors. They looked like collapsed survey stations, patched over with decades of dust and mineral debris. They'd been built that way, so unremarkable they didn't appear on any live scans. Their payloads weren't explosive, they didn't need to be. Each platform housed a single kinetic rod, tungsten-tipped, carbon-sheathed, unpowered but precisely aligned. They didn't launch so much as drop, aided only by silent gravitic slip assists. The rods hit their marks 8 minutes later. 3 Kithari communication arrays vanished mid-pulse. There was no glow, no explosion, just erasure. The rods hit with enough force to liquefy through reinforced shielding, bypassing thermal detection by arriving in freefall. Each relay point critical for intra-fleet synchronization folded in on itself one after the other without a single signal of warning. The Ascendancy fleet hesitated for the first time. Not because they feared reprisal, but because they didn't know what had triggered it. Their scans showed no trajectory, no missile launch, just nothing. One moment the comms existed, the next, the web began fraying. Inside Aegir, Hull observed the ripple effect. Kithari scout wings began adjusting their telemetry protocols. Their formations constricted. The wide arcs narrowed into tighter defensive bands, guarding against an invisible threat, but the wrong one. They weren't circling against an enemy position. They were circling shadows. Cinder continued to simulate instability. Civilian comms flickered with terrified nonsense broadcasts. Drone signals looped half-coded coordinates. Automated defense towers in uninhabited zones activated useless countermeasures that sparked briefly before going silent again. Every movement baited the Kithari deeper. Hull's expression didn't change, but his next move was immediate. He began rerouting the mining platforms into standby positioning for fallback intercepts. This wasn't about damage, it was about rhythm. The moment Earth fired again without mystery, the game would break. The illusion would die. Let the enemy think they'd stumbled into a disorganized species tearing itself apart. Let them believe they were untangling a panic, not walking into a plan. Above the equator, 3 Kithari reinforcement wings began deployment toward the South Atlantic corridor, intending to establish a forward command post near what appeared to be a destabilized power network. They didn't realize that every beacon drawing them in had been activated 36 hours before their arrival, by freight ships scheduled to shut down 2 months earlier, freight ships carrying nothing. Or so it seemed. From the dark side of the moon, a brief solar reflection pulsed across an old satellite dish, one that hadn't moved in 20 years. It pivoted now. Inside Aegir, the Delphi matrix updated its sync table. Phase 3 was no longer theoretical, and Earth had not yet spoken a single word. The first Kithari gunships pierced the stratosphere like spear points, slashing through cloud banks with the precision of a species that had conquered a dozen worlds by orbital superiority alone. Their descent formations followed a doctrine engineered to crush resistance before it formed, layered shock teams, hovering artillery nodes, and kinetic breaches descending along thermally optimized corridors. From orbit, they saw little to resist. Earth's comms were fractured, its skies dimmed, and its defenses, what few they'd catalogued, had already misfired or shut down. The strategy was simple: saturate the upper atmosphere, establish line-of-sight overwatch, and reduce any surface coordination into ash. But when their targeting arrays blinked to life, there was nothing to lock onto. From repurposed cargo freighters drifting just outside upper atmo range, millions of microdrones spilled into the skies. They didn't fire, they didn't jam, they cloaked. A fog veil, dense, particulate, tuned to bend and fracture optical and electromagnetic signatures, unfolded like a second sky. It moved with the wind, but not aimlessly. It responded to radar sweeps, reshaped itself to mimic atmosphere, Herrick interference, and rerouted thermals. Kithari scanners showed shifting shadows where cities should have been, collapsing echoes where troop clusters were expected. It was camouflage on a planetary scale, and they hadn't seen it coming. Inside Aegir, Commander Hall didn't speak. He didn't have to. His neural interface pulsed in sync with the underground net. Earth's surface defenses hadn't been built in bunkers or command centers. They'd been laced into the ground itself, through utility conduits, railways, water systems, and power grids that had always served two purposes. Across the globe, human militia cells, civilians in appearance, operators in function, activated in unison. They didn't receive orders. They synced. A janitor in a collapsed metro tunnel opened a maintenance hatch and emerged in exo-rigged armor, eyes glowing with neural thread sync. A crop duster pilot from the Kansas plains initiated a local fog veil node before climbing into what looked like a fertilizer plane, but wasn't. In the ruins of an old naval scrapyard, 3 retired technicians tapped their palms against rusted consoles that came alive, drawing power from long-dead circuits. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The sync carried intent. Kithari descent teams, meanwhile, began encountering friction. Their breaches missed their targets, not from misfire, but from absence. Marked locations yielded empty planes, false thermal profiles, or impact-absorbing gel layers disguised beneath natural terrain. Gunships deployed in staggered descent patterns began colliding with invisible turbulence. Their inertial compensators registered no reason for the shifts because the cause wasn't mechanical. It was algorithmic. Earth's shield bursts, localized electromagnetic disruptors hidden beneath civilian zones, detonated in perfectly timed pulses, calculated not to destroy the gunships but to nudge them out, off trajectory by mere degrees. Just enough for collisions to occur, just enough for panic to set in. Still, the Kithari tried to adapt. They restructured formation density, reduced descent angles, shifted to broad target saturation modes. That was when the real collapse began. Every attempt to stabilize met with interference, not in comms, but in feedback. Earth's SyncNet wasn't broadcasting on any frequency they could trace. Human operators moved in tight units, invisible to thermal tracking, activated only when enemy vectors aligned with known kill zones. There was no command to intercept, no orders to jam, just movement. One Kithari dropship touched down outside what looked like a ruined medical district in northern India. Before the ramp could lower, a cluster of human operatives emerged from beneath collapsed pavement. They didn't fire. They planted repulsor mines in silence, retreated into cover, and activated a localized fog bloom. By the time the Kithari crew engaged visual targeting, their internal nav systems had mapped the wrong floor plan, and their ramp opened into a dead corridor flooded with their own misdirected fire. In Tokyo's submerged lower wards, a node of Earth's defense lattice pulsed once, activating hundreds of synched operatives across Eastern Asia. Every move they made correlated with seismic activity, thermal drift, and wind vector data collected hours earlier. Their precision wasn't from orders, it was from rhythm. They weren't following plans, they were the plan. In Aegir, Hall's interface didn't display objectives. It displayed resonance, waves of sync compression, peaks of activation across tactical fields. The Kithari thought they were fighting panic. They had walked into pattern. The psychological shift was slow, but irreversible. The ascendancy had entered Earthspace expecting a fragmented civilization, a species that bickered through delay, that fought late and loud. What they saw now wasn't panic. It was absence of noise. A battlefield. Too quiet. Units that didn't respond to provocation, didn't cluster for defense, didn't call for reinforcements. They simply acted, before the enemy could understand what needed resisting. Across 3 continents, Kithari fire teams found their landing zones nullified, their lines of advance obscured, their overwatch units blind. They fired anyway. They fired at shadows, noise bursts, thermal ghosts. Nothing landed. Every confirmed kill turned out to be a mannequin, a thermal decoy, a drone husk designed to mimic human movement before vanishing into mist. Their targeting logs filled with static, then cleared, then misaligned again. Commander Hall exhaled slowly as the last gunship blinked off the satellite overlay, not destroyed, just aimless. The enemy was now airborne, fully deployed and blind. Earth had not only disappeared from their senses, it had disappeared from their understanding. The Kithari did not believe in escalation as a failure of control. To them, it was a necessary stage of conquest, an application of mass until resistance crumbled. Their doctrine had worked on 100 worlds. When confusion met firepower, firepower always prevailed. So when their descent patterns collapsed into blind stumbles, when their gunships vanished into weather patterns that didn't exist, when their scouts failed to return coherent data from Earth's surface, they reverted to doctrine: saturation. It began with the upward redirection of their orbital frigates. Instead of holding high altitude for surveillance, they lowered position, bracketing Earth's atmospheric shell with strike-capable nodes. Dozens of high-yield charges armed simultaneously. The plan was primitive in concept but effective. Burn away the unknown. Saturate everything. Flood the field with enough fire and static that even ghosts couldn't move without being noticed. Earth's silence would not survive the volume. But silence wasn't a defense anymore. It was a signal. Inside Aegir, Rivenhall stood before the Delphi terminal, his neural sync already engaged. His breathing was measured, his pulse low. He didn't issue an alert. He didn't warn his ground teams. He keyed a 3-point authorization into a redundant interface built into the chamber wall. From it, a buried relay activated, not in space but beneath the floor. Cables hissed. The room dimmed. A single system came online without flare or announcement. Vardis. The virtual adaptive retaliation and disruption interface system hadn't been built to fight battles. It was built to collapse belief. Pattern recognition was the spine of every military machine the Kithari used. Command executed through recursive hierarchies, logic stacks layered through clean translation trees. They didn't understand entropy as a tactic. They understood control. So VAR, DIS, gave them control, just slightly wrong. Kithari targeting arrays began adjusting to noise bursts that weren't there. Command nodes received orders that weren't issued. Communications between strike wings began to diverge in timing, not enough to spark concern, but enough to cause drift. 2 frigates launched decoy sweeps at the same quadrant, unaware they had mirrored each other's operations based on clone telemetry from 5 minutes earlier. Their return signals confirmed false data, which was logged into command routines, which shaped the next strike sequence, which missed entirely. A destroyer squad assigned to redeploy over the Pacific issued an unauthorized acceleration burn, narrowly avoiding collision with an allied vessel. Its crew insisted the movement matched orbital control. Orbital control denied issuing it. The logs matched. The voices didn't. A translator node deep in the fleet's relay spine had begun introducing minor syntactic loops, subtle changes in command phrasing that delayed interpretation by 2 seconds. 2 seconds was enough to lose sync, enough to reverse formation logic, enough to make it look like someone was issuing bad orders. But no one was. And that was the point. From orbit, the Kithari still saw no return fire, no human strike waves, no launch signatures, and yet their systems were shifting under them. Frigates began drifting out of position, not from damage, but from misalignment of shared velocity data. When they corrected, they overcompensated. The result was not chaos, but uncertainty. Each course correction made them less confident, not more. Inside their command tier, the breakdown was more severe. Coordination between wings began to degrade, not collapse, but lag. One commander's message overlapped with another's, both responding to a signal that only one of them had received. Over time, formation leaders began to doubt which interface represented real-time data. Even their response teams hesitated, afraid that acting too quickly might mean executing the wrong command, or acting on something never sent at all. Meanwhile, Earth's ground forces vanished completely from visual tracking. No targets, no emissions, no evidence of engagement. Because they'd stopped engaging. Hall's strategy wasn't to fight harder, it was to let the enemy drown in their own input. Vardis fed them precisely what they needed to believe, just offset by fractions, just layered with decay, just corrupted enough to fracture logic from inside. The Kithari had expected a culture of noise, a civilization of disunity. They were now caught in a loop of silent opposition where every pattern they trusted betrayed them. One Kithari escort vessel, unable to sync with its sister ship, fired a precision burst at what it believed was an enemy heat bloom. It hit an allied cruiser. The cruiser's countermeasure system, confused by the attack origin, launched a blind retaliatory spread. Damage was minimal, trust was not. By the time Orbit Control issued a fleet-wide override, Vardis had already infected the override stream, not with malware, with possibility. Commands arrived clean but were responded to incorrectly. One wing began descent without support. Another ceased operations awaiting non-existent updates. The illusion wasn't that they were under attack. It was that they weren't sure anymore who was responding and who wasn't. Inside Aegir, Hal watched the overlays without expression. The map no longer needed active input. Earth's defenses had ceased to. Transmission hours earlier. Silence had become sharper than firepower. The enemy's greatest fear wasn't death, it was miscalculation. And now they were calculating against themselves. By the end of the day cycle, 3 Kithari formation clusters had disengaged entirely, not from damage, but from lack of cohesion. They retreated into upper orbit to re-establish command sync, only to discover that their data trees no longer aligned. One commander issued a standby signal to regroup, another interpreted it as a recall, a third ignored it altogether. What had once been a unified invasion fleet had become a web of self-conflicting movement, each node doubting its place in the chain, and Earth had yet to fire a single shot. By the third planetary orbit cycle, the Kithari formation had begun to drift in silence, not the ordered silence of a war machine in focus, but the kind that followed confusion too deep to name. Frigates hovered in orbit without formation, patrol wings circled with weapons armed but unfired. Commands flickered across bandwidths without certainty of receipt. Some moved, some didn't. The ascendancy had not been broken, not in the way Earth's older wars might have defined it. No wreckage, no falling bodies, but in something more dangerous, indecision. Vardis did not jam, deceive, or override. It did not touch their systems directly. It simply lived inside the logical frames the Kithari trusted most, until trust became poison. Now, with no Earth weapons in sight and no clarity in their own ranks, the ascendancy began to do what it had never done in battle, hesitate in place. Then, Earth responded. It wasn't a counterstrike, it wasn't even a transmission. From 3 low Earth orbital towers once used for broadcast news in the early 21st century, a narrowband channel lit up. No encryption, no targeting beacons, no demands, just audio. The broadcast began with static, then a low hum, then a voice, grainy, old, clipped by the limits of analog tape. It wasn't an announcement, it was a history. Speeches, commands, propaganda lines, and field radio from humanity's ancient wars crackled to life, patched together in a non-linear stream. Fragments from battles long since forgotten. A D-Day weather report, a Vietnam field medic's distress call, a Cold War president insisting the line must be held. Voices layered over one another, unedited, unapologetic. To the Kithari, it meant nothing and everything. The signal came from 3 beacons positioned equidistantly, forming a precise vector through the center of their fractured fleet. The broadcast was neither threat nor surrender, but it opened a path. One of their formation leaders proposed immediate withdrawal, citing structural degradation of command protocols combined with logic tree interference too precise to attribute to chance. Another demanded an offensive reset, accusing Earth of psychological warfare designed to mask vulnerability. A third commander pointed out that no actual enemy signatures had presented themselves in 28 hours, suggesting Earth may have already surrendered and was simply broadcasting cultural residue. But none of them moved first, because none of them knew what the corridor was. It had all the signs of a trap, but no teeth, no closing mechanisms, no follow-through. And that's what made it impossible to interpret. Every fallback maneuver initiated by the fleet misfired within seconds. Retraction routes were corrupted, not by interference but by miscommunication. A scout wing attempting to retreat along the corridor's edge received conflicting orders from two overlapping authorities. The wing split. One half was redirected into orbit above the Sahara. The other disappeared into the atmosphere where no signals followed. No shot was fired. No ship was struck. But panic didn't need an explosion. Within hours, the corridor became the only space the fleet hadn't tripped over itself. Earth sent nothing more. No message, no envoy, no confirmation. The implication hung there in orbit like a dare. You can leave, but you must do it through our chosen path, and you'll never know if it was a gift or a warning. Some among the Kithari saw it as surrender. Others called it humiliation disguised as charity, but Hal hadn't designed it for either. Inside Aegir, he watched the fleet realign, ship by ship, into the narrow vector Earth had cleared for them. His hands never touched the console. His voice remained unused. Delphi fed no updates. Nothing moved from Earth except silence. One by one, Kithari vessels began to peel away, slowly at first, as if waiting for retaliation. Then more. Entire squadrons drifted backward into the corridor, keeping distance from each other, each afraid the movement itself might trigger something. None of them realized that fear had already done the work. As the final Kithari command ship passed the edge of Earth's orbital field, the broadcast ceased. The signal didn't fade. It terminated, like a light being switched off. No debris, no orbit scars, no ship trails. Just a closed lane where none had existed before. The Kithari fleet vanished from Sol without retaliation, treaty, or conclusion. Not because Earth had won in any recognizable sense, but because the Ascendancy no longer possessed a framework to measure what was happening. They hadn't been defeated. They'd been made irrelevant. And as they crossed the last telemetry line, leaving Earth space behind, there were no human eyes watching. No transmissions followed, no pursuit, just the corridor behind them, sealed, gone. They left Earth space as if exiting a maze they never understood. There were no parades, no headlines, no flag raised in defiance of an enemy sent running. Across Earth's public networks, the day passed as if nothing had happened. Freight routes resumed, power grids recalibrated. Satellites once tasked with veiling military operations returned to streaming weather patterns and oceanic drift charts. Every trace of Earth's defense lattice folded back into civilian infrastructure like muscle retreating into bone. Not because victory had been declared, but because nothing was meant to be visible. Victory, if it existed at all, remained unspoken. Inside Aegir, systems shut down in sequence. Not in a rush, not with ceremony, just with finality. Screens dimmed, sync nodes disconnected one by one, shield corridors depressurized. The Delphi matrix powered off, its final pulse sealing the vault that held its core. What was left behind wasn't a monument. It was absence. The command node that had once guided a world's hidden response vanished back into frozen stone, unrecoverable by even those who'd stood inside it. Hal stood alone in the corridor that led to the extraction shaft. His interface had already been unlinked, the neural thread sterilized. No data followed him. No one watched his departure. That, too, was part of the plan. His presence had been necessary only as long as Earth required the ghost of command. Now, with the corridor sealed and the Ascendancy gone, even that ghost was no longer welcome. He left Aegir without trace, boarded the same drone that had retrieved him weeks ago, and returned to the bay where the tide still rose, indifferent to the fact that he'd saved the world. He didn't unpack. He didn't need to. The outpost had remained untouched. The waves greeted him with the same indifference. He resumed his silence as though nothing had interrupted it, erasing the man he'd temporarily become. In time, even those who'd served under him would forget. Because forgetting was essential. Earth's safety had never come from force, it had come from unreadability. The more the world remembered, the more visible it became. And visibility in this new age was weakness. Global coalitions, those few who'd been granted partial access to the directive, agreed to terms that were never written. No interviews, no disclosures, no technologies revealed. The incident was reclassified as a high-altitude surveillance anomaly. The few surface glitches recorded, brief blackouts, signal interference, thermal distortions, were explained as natural phenomena. Climate, solar activity, atmospheric instability, the kind of lies people preferred because they came without consequence. In the vast void beyond Neptune, the Kithari fleet drifted in fractured silence. Post-engagement reports arrived in incomplete strings, corrupted not by human interference, but by their own internal desynchronization. They couldn't agree on what had happened. Some commanders swore Earth had deployed disorienting weapons. Others insisted no weapons had been used at all. The only consistent factor across every report, silence. Not the lack of sound, but the presence of deliberate quiet. At the Kithari War Academy, the incident was reclassified, not as a defeat, but as a doctrinal disruption. Tactical education modules issued new engagement protocols for unprofiled species. The advisory attached to Earth was brief, translated into 4 dialects. Do not engage until the silence speaks first. No one among them could define what that meant, but none dared ignore it. And so, Earth returned to the rhythm of its ordinary chaos. Traffic resumed. Satellites resumed transmitting vacation packages and telecom pricing. Children returned to school. Politics resumed its theater. Humanity, as it always had, moved on not by choice, but by necessity. But somewhere below the surface, buried in non-state archives and sealed under layers of noise, the knowledge remained. Not of triumph, but of preparedness. A different kind of power, the kind that didn't need to roar. There were no celebrations, no martyrs, no cinematic final messages broadcast to a grateful species. Just Hal, watching the tide roll in, knowing that the greatest weapon Earth had ever built had never fired a shot. Somewhere, at the far edge of the solar system, a deep space relay blinked once. A gravitational distortion. Small, fast, faint. Another anomaly. The relay didn't broadcast. It didn't activate shields. It remained silent, just as it had been designed to. What if the most dangerous species in the galaxy wasn't the loudest, but the one that never had to speak at all? Would you have trusted the corridor Earth opened, or would you have fired first? Let us know in the comments, what would you have done in the Kithari's place? If this story gave you chills, hit that subscribe button.